Jake and I had been together for 5 years, 5 solid years. We met in college, and right from the start, everything just clicked. We talked about our future, the home we'd buy, the kids we might have, the places we wanted to travel to. We even had a running list of potential baby names. Jake was my partner in every sense, someone I trusted completely. My family adored him too. He was practically a part of it. Then, there was Emily, my sister, my closest confidant. She and I were inseparable growing up. We shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams, even our most embarrassing moments. Emily was the person I turned to whenever I was feeling down, and she always had my back, no matter what. Our bond was unbreakable, or so I thought. That's why, when Jake blindsided me with the breakup, I ran straight to Emily. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie when he turned to me with this strange look in his eyes. He said, "We need to talk." I thought he was about to tell me something trivial, maybe about a job offer or something at work, but instead he dropped the bomb. "I need space, I'm not feeling it anymore." I sat there, stunned, as he rambled on about needing time to figure himself out and how he didn't want to hurt me. But I couldn't understand. We hadn't fought recently. There were no signs that anything was wrong. I tried to ask why, to get a reason, but he just kept saying vague things like, "I don't know, I just need to do this." It felt like my entire world was falling apart right there in my living room. For the next few days, I was a mess. I couldn't eat or sleep. My mind kept racing, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. I reached out to my friends, hoping they might know something, but they were just as clueless. I even called Emily and told her everything. She seemed shocked and promised to be there for me. She offered to come over that night, but I told her I needed some time alone. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. A mutual friend of ours called me. Her voice was hesitant, and I could sense something was off. After some awkward small talk, she finally blurted out, "I'm so sorry, but you need to know, Jake is seeing Emily." I felt like the ground was pulled from under me. I could barely process what I'd just heard. Emily, my sister, my closest ally, had been seeing Jake, the same Jake who had broken up with me just days ago. I felt sick to my stomach. I thanked my friend for telling me and hung up, my hands shaking as I dialed Emily's number. Emily answered on the second ring, her voice sounding a little too cheerful. I didn't waste any time. I asked her point blank, "Are you seeing Jake?" There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, could almost picture the panic on her face. Finally, she broke down and confessed. She told me they had been seeing each other for a few months now, and that they were officially a couple. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I asked her why. How could she do this to me? She started crying, saying she never meant for it to happen, that it just did. She said she had been jealous of my relationship with Jake for years and acted impulsively. But the worst was yet to come. She then dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant with Jake's child. I don't know what hurt more, the fact that my boyfriend of 5 years had left me for my sister, or that my own sister had betrayed me in such a profound way. It felt like I was being stabbed from all sides. My mind went numb. I felt disconnected from everything around me. I needed comfort, so I went to the only other people I thought I could rely on, my parents. I arrived at their house in tears, barely able to get the words out. I expected them to be furious, to comfort me, to take my side. Instead, they were surprisingly calm, almost detached. They kept repeating phrases like "things happen," and "we need to keep the family together." They suggested I should try to forgive Emily and Jake, to move past it for the sake of family harmony. I was stunned by their reaction. Here I was, reeling from this double betrayal, and all they seemed to care about was maintaining some false sense of peace. I tried to argue, to explain how deeply I'd been hurt, but they just kept saying I needed to forgive and forget, like it was that simple. I left their house feeling more alone than ever. I felt trapped, betrayed by my boyfriend, my sister, and now, it seemed, even my own parents. Everywhere I turned, there was no one to really lean on. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it all, but it just kept getting more complicated. I knew I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next, but it was clear that my life would never be the same again. A few days after I'd learned about Emily and Jake, my parents insisted on having a family dinner to talk things through. They were determined to play peacemakers, and had organized it like some kind of intervention. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but I also knew that I needed answers. I needed to hear what Emily and Jake had to say for themselves, and I wanted to see if my parents would keep pushing their forgive and forget narrative in front of everyone. I arrived at their house, my stomach churning with nerves. The atmosphere inside was tense and awkward right from the start. My parents were bustling around, pretending everything was normal, but their forced smiles said otherwise. Emily and Jake showed up a little later, walking in together, trying to act casual. They looked nervous, and I could tell they were both trying too hard to seem relaxed. It was like they were playing a part in a bad play, and everyone knew the script was terrible. My parents tried to keep the conversation light, talking about trivial things, weather, neighbors, anything but the giant elephant in the room. I just sat there, watching Emily and Jake across the table, waiting for someone to finally address what had happened. I couldn't take the fake small talk any longer, so I stood up and said I needed a drink of water. Emily followed me into the kitchen, and I knew this was my chance to confront her. Once we were alone, I turned to Emily and asked her directly why she did it. At first, she seemed caught off guard, like she didn't expect me to be so blunt. But then she started talking. She said she'd been jealous of my relationship with Jake for years. She felt like I had everything: our parents' approval, a stable relationship, and a plan for the future. She admitted that she acted impulsively, that she didn't mean for things to go this far. She claimed that she never planned to get pregnant, that it just happened, and now she was scared. Emily looked at me with teary eyes, insisting that she loved Jake and wanted to make things work with him. I felt numb listening to her. I asked her if she had ever thought about how this would affect me or our family. She didn't have a real answer for that, just a lot of apologies and excuses. It was clear that she was still more focused on what she wanted than on the damage she'd caused. Jake must have sensed the tension because he joined us in the kitchen, looking defensive but trying to act calm. He started to explain himself, saying that he didn't mean to hurt me, that he fell out of love and didn't know how to end things properly. He kept saying he never wanted it to happen like this, that he just wanted to be honest now. He asked for understanding, claiming he was trying to do the right thing by being upfront. I listened, but his words felt hollow. It was hard to look at him, knowing that everything we'd planned and dreamed of had been destroyed so easily. When we returned to the dining room, my parents were ready with their next move. They issued an ultimatum. Either I made peace with Emily and Jake, or I would risk being left out of future family gatherings and events. They kept talking about the future baby, framing it as a new beginning for the family, like this child would magically fix everything. They emphasized they didn't want any drama or bad blood, as if my feelings were just an inconvenience to be swept under the rug. I sat there, stunned, while they talked. It was like they were trying to paint over everything with a broad brush of forced positivity. I could feel the pressure building, like they were trying to corner me into agreeing with them, into just accepting everything and moving on. But then, a few days after that awful dinner, I heard from a mutual friend. She had heard rumors that the affair might have started much earlier than Emily had admitted. There were whispers of secret meetings, planned trips, things that didn't add up with what I had been told. I asked her to tell me everything she knew, and that's when she shared some screenshots she'd received from another friend. The messages showed Jake and Emily talking about being together while Jake was still planning a future with me. I stared at those messages, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut all over again. It was clear that Emily and Jake had been involved much earlier than they'd admitted. The messages hinted at sneaky rendezvous, plans made behind my back, all while I was clueless and trusting both of them completely. I started to piece together the timeline in my head, realizing just how much of my relationship with Jake had been a lie. How long had they been deceiving me? Had every moment I thought was special between us been tainted by their betrayal? I felt like I was losing my grip on what was real. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just let this go. I had to find out the full extent of what had happened. I decided to dig deeper, to uncover every detail of their deceit. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story to make themselves look like the victims. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to know the truth, not just for closure but to understand how deep this betrayal ran. I was left with more questions than answers, and I had a feeling there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered. I was ready to do whatever it took to find out how far back this had started and just how much of my life had been built on their lies. After that family dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about those screenshots. It felt like there was so much more to this story, so many more secrets that I needed to uncover. I decided to start digging deeper. I pulled out my laptop and began combing through old messages, emails, and social media posts. I went back months, even years, trying to find any inconsistencies, any hints that things weren't as they seemed. It didn't take long before I started noticing little things. Flirty comments from Emily on Jake's old photos that I'd dismissed at the time, messages between them that seemed too familiar for comfort. I found a few hidden chats on Jake's social media accounts where the tone was way too casual for just friends. There were mentions of meeting up without me, inside jokes I'd never heard before. It was clear that this hadn't just started a few months ago. I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, one that was showing me a picture I didn't want to see. The more I found, the more I realized that their relationship had been going on for much longer than they'd admitted. There were gaps in the timeline that didn't make sense. Weekends when Jake had told me he was busy with work or friends, but there were pictures of him and Emily at some event I wasn't even aware of. Still, it wasn't enough. I needed more proof, more concrete evidence that could show exactly how long this affair had been happening. So I decided to reach out to Jake's former roommate, a guy named Mark. Mark and Jake had shared an apartment until about a year ago when Mark moved to another city. I remembered that Mark had always been a bit of a gossip, so I figured he might have some insight. Mark was hesitant at first, but after I explained what I'd discovered, he opened up. He told me that he'd suspected something between Jake and Emily for a while. He mentioned how he'd noticed Emily visiting their apartment more often when I wasn't around. At first, he thought she was just being friendly, but then there were times when he'd come home early, and they'd be alone, talking quietly in Jake's room, looking a bit too close for comfort. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, so he kept his suspicions to himself. This was the first confirmation from someone else that something had been off. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. I started thinking about all those times when Emily had shown up unexpectedly, or when Jake had acted strange and brushed it off as stress or work. Then, something unexpected happened. I got a message from Emily's ex-boyfriend, Dan. He reached out saying he'd heard about what was going on from mutual friends. He said he wasn't surprised at all. According to him, Emily had always been competitive with me, always trying to one-up me in some way. He claimed she'd shown interest in Jake from the very beginning, even when we first started dating. Dan even had more evidence. photos of Emily and Jake together at parties and events where I wasn't present. In one picture, they were standing closer than they should have been, their faces turned toward each other in a way that suggested intimacy. There were also text exchanges between Emily and Dan, where Emily hinted at having feelings for someone who was off limits. It all started to make sense. Emily had been after Jake for a long time, and Jake had been playing along while still pretending to be with me. Armed with all this new information, I decided it was time to confront my parents again. I needed to know why they were so willing to forgive Emily and Jake, why they seemed more interested in preserving the family image than supporting me. I laid everything out for them. The messages, the photos, the timeline that showed Emily and Jake's affair went back much further than they'd claimed. My parents didn't seem surprised. They admitted they'd known about the relationship earlier than they let on. They said they'd kept quiet because they didn't want to upset the family. I could barely believe what I was hearing. They knew about the betrayal, yet they chose to stay silent and ask me to just accept it. And then things took an even stranger turn. One evening, while I was still trying to process everything, I overheard a conversation between my parents and Emily. I was in the hallway, just outside the living room. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but I heard my name and stopped. They were discussing something about financial support, a deal with Jake. My mom was saying that they had done what they needed to do to keep things from getting messy. It clicked in that moment. Maybe this wasn't just about family harmony or saving face. Maybe my parents had their own reasons, something to do with money or a deal with Jake. I started suspecting that there might be some kind of financial arrangement or support they had promised Jake if he stayed with Emily. It would explain why they were so desperate to have everyone make amends. I decided right then that I needed to confront Jake and Emily again, but this time I wouldn't go in blind. I had proof now, and I had a feeling there was more to this than just a love triangle. I needed to find out exactly what my parents had been hiding, what kind of deal they'd made, and why they were so invested in pushing me to reconcile. The betrayal had layers I hadn't even imagined, and I was going to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. I decided it was time to confront Jake and Emily face to face, but I knew I needed a neutral place where things wouldn't get too heated. I chose a quiet cafe on the edge of town. It wasn't a place we'd ever gone together, so it felt less charged with old memories. I sent them both a message asking to meet, and after some hesitation, they agreed. I could sense their nervousness even through the screen. The day of the meeting, I arrived early and took a seat in a corner where I could see the door. When they walked in together, they looked wary, like they were preparing for a battle they weren't sure they could win. Jake's eyes darted around, avoiding mine, while Emily tried to keep her face neutral but ended up looking more defensive than calm. I didn't waste time. I laid out everything I had: photos, messages, testimonies. I started with the screenshots showing their conversations, the ones where they'd talked about being together while Jake was still making plans with me. I showed them the photos from parties and events where they were too close, too familiar, the ones I wasn't at. I mentioned what Jake's former roommate had noticed, how he'd seen Emily around the apartment more than I ever knew. Then I pulled out the texts from Emily's ex-boyfriend, which clearly showed her interest in Jake from the very beginning. Jake's face went pale as I went through each piece of evidence. He started to panic, his hands trembling slightly. Emily looked like she was trying to find a way to argue, but I could see her confidence crumbling. She opened her mouth a few times, as if to defend herself, but each time I brought out something new, she faltered. It was clear they hadn't expected me to gather so much. Finally, Jake broke down. He admitted that he felt trapped from the moment Emily told him she was pregnant. He confessed that Emily had pushed him into the relationship, using the pregnancy as a reason. He'd felt pressured by her, and eventually even by my parents, who wanted to avoid any scandal. Jake said he was told that if he left Emily, it would ruin the family's reputation, and my parents had even hinted at financial consequences for him if he didn't go along. Jake kept talking, spilling out more details. He claimed he never wanted any of this, that he didn't know how to end it once Emily had told him about the pregnancy. He'd felt cornered and manipulated, not just by Emily but also by my parents. It was like a dam had burst and everything he'd been holding back came pouring out. Emily, meanwhile, looked furious, like she couldn't believe he was throwing her under the bus. Then, things took a turn I hadn't expected. Emily, with a mix of anger and desperation, blurted out that she wasn't actually pregnant when she first told everyone. She admitted she'd made it up because she was afraid Jake would leave her. She'd been so desperate to hold on to him that she'd lied about the pregnancy. She revealed that she was genuinely pregnant now, but the timeline was different, and it wasn't the result of when she first claimed. Jake's face fell. He looked completely devastated, realizing he'd been manipulated by everyone, including Emily and my parents. Emily tried to explain herself, saying she was scared and felt like she was losing everything, but her words sounded hollow in the face of all the lies. At that point, I knew I had to bring my parents into this. I confronted them with everything I'd overheard about the secret arrangement. I told them what Jake had confessed, that they had offered him financial support to marry Emily and keep the family reputation intact. They didn't even bother denying it. My father calmly admitted that they had made the offer because they believed it was the best way to protect the family from public embarrassment. They tried to justify their actions, claiming they were thinking of the future, the family's name, and how a scandal would affect everyone. The room went silent for a moment, the weight of all the revelations hanging heavy in the air. Jake looked like he'd just been hit by a truck, realizing how deep the manipulation had gone. Emily was still trying to defend herself, saying she never meant to hurt anyone, that she just didn't know what else to do. But it was clear that her lies had caught up with her, and now she was struggling to find a way out. Then, the unexpected twist hit everyone in the room. Emily confessed that she hadn't been sure Jake would stay with her, even after she'd claimed to be pregnant. She'd hoped that announcing the pregnancy would push him to commit, but when he started to hesitate, she got scared. That's when she went to my parents for help, knowing they would do anything to avoid a scandal. Jake seemed to realize at that moment just how deep he'd been pulled into this mess. He looked at Emily with a mix of anger and hurt, understanding that he'd been manipulated from all sides. He looked like a man who had lost everything in one fell swoop: his relationship with me, whatever trust he had with Emily, and now even the support he thought he had from my parents. As the full extent of the betrayal and manipulation came to light, I felt a strange mix of vindication and confusion. I had the answers I'd been looking for, but they were far more complicated and twisted than I had imagined. I stood there, trying to process everything, knowing I had to decide my next move. I could expose everyone, let the world see what they had done, or I could cut ties completely and walk away from this mess. Either way, I knew things would never be the same. After everything came to light at the cafe, I knew I couldn't stay trapped in the web of lies and manipulation any longer. I made a decision right then and there. I had to break free from all of it. I couldn't keep pretending that everything would somehow work out or that I could just forgive and forget. The betrayal had gone too deep, and the trust was shattered beyond repair. I packed up my things and moved out of the apartment I'd shared with Jake. I found a small place on the other side of town, far away from all the memories. I changed my phone number, blocked Emily, Jake, and even my parents on social media. I needed distance, space to breathe and think without the constant reminder of what had happened. I cut off all communication with them. It was like pulling off a band-aid, painful but necessary. I started focusing on myself for the first time in what felt like forever. I threw myself into my job, taking on new projects and responsibilities. I made a conscious effort to rebuild my life without the constant drama and toxicity that had surrounded me for so long. It wasn't easy, but each day felt a little lighter, a little more bearable. Then the news of the confrontation spread among our friends and extended family. People talked, and everyone had their own opinions. Some were supportive, understanding why I had to walk away. Others accused me of being dramatic, saying I should have just forgiven them and moved on. I heard whispers of how I was tearing the family apart or making things worse, but I stood firm in my decision, knowing that I had done what was best for my sanity and well-being. In the midst of all this, I found solace in unexpected places. Some friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to offer support. I made new friends who admired my strength to stand up for myself, to say no to the pressure and the manipulation. Slowly, I built a new circle of people who genuinely cared for me, without any hidden agendas. A few weeks later, Emily reached out. She asked to meet one last time. I agreed, but only out of curiosity, not because I wanted to rekindle any sort of relationship with her. We met at a park, and she looked different, tired, almost defeated. She apologized, acknowledging that her actions were driven by fear, insecurity, and a desperate need to hold on to Jake. She said she was trying to be a better person for the sake of her child and wanted to clear the air between us. I listened, but I remained guarded. I wished her well, told her I hoped she could find peace and happiness, but I made it clear that I wasn't interested in rebuilding any sort of relationship with her. Too much had happened, and the wounds were still too fresh. She seemed to understand, and we parted ways without any more words. Not long after that, I heard that Jake had decided to leave the city. The fallout from everything that had happened had overwhelmed him, and he wanted to start fresh somewhere new. A few days before he left, I received a letter from him. He apologized for everything, expressed his regret, and wished me nothing but happiness. He said he was ashamed of his actions and how things had ended between us. I read the letter, but I chose not to respond. There was nothing left to say. Jake had made his choices, and I had made mine. I needed to keep moving forward, not looking back. Months passed, and slowly I began to feel a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I started dating again, nothing serious, just enjoying the company of new people without the weight of the past hanging over me. I got a new job opportunity, something that challenged me and gave me a sense of purpose again. I also began seeing a therapist to help me process everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. It helped more than I expected, allowing me to finally start healing from the trauma. One day, I decided to share my story online. Not for sympathy, not to air my dirty laundry, but to find closure and maybe help someone else who might be going through something similar. I wrote everything down, the entire journey from the breakup to the confrontations, the betrayals, and finally, the decision to break free and move on. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people all over, some sharing their own experiences, others offering words of support. It was cathartic, knowing that my story might have given someone else the strength to stand up for themselves, to walk away from a toxic situation. As I wrote this last update, I realized just how far I'd come. I wasn't the same person I was at the start of all this. I had been through hell and back, but I had survived. I had learned to set boundaries, to prioritize my own well-being, and to let go of the things that no longer served me. So I decided that this would be my final post. I thanked everyone who had supported me through this journey and made it clear that I was moving on, focusing on myself, and building a life free from the shadows of my past. I left a message of strength and hope for anyone dealing with betrayal or family drama, reminding them that they are not alone and that it's okay to put themselves first. This is where my story ends, but it's also where my new chapter begins.